The Wall Street Journal reported that the Biden administration has finally concluded that, yes, COVID was not naturally occurring. It didn't emerge organically from a pangolin, whatever that is, at the wet market, whatever that is. No, the virus came from a Chinese military lab where it was created. That's the determination of the Department of Energy based on new intelligence that, of course, everyone already had. Now, we learned this, interestingly, from a newspaper. We did not learn it directly from the Biden administration because Joe Biden hasn't said a word about it. And that's a little odd. 1 million Americans, they tell us, died of COVID. Close to 7 million died globally. So it's inherently a big story. Now, it is true that the origin of COVID is not directly related to anti-trans racism. So it's not unnatural for Joe Biden. He doesn't have his talking points already written. But it might still make for a good topic for, say, a primetime address to the nation. He might mention it to us. He might answer a few other questions while he's at it. For example, is Joe Biden still sending money to China for biotech research? The administration was actually doing that, sending cash to that same Wuhan lab as recently as last year. Are they still doing that? And bigger picture, have their views on China changed now that they know that China is responsible for the deaths of almost 7 million people? Now that we know China unleashed COVID on the world, intentionally or not, and then lied about it for sure, and then hid life-saving genetic information about the virus from the scientists who are trying to respond to COVID. Now we know all of that. Does Joe Biden still consider Vladimir Putin, he's so bad, the greatest threat to world peace and stability? It does seem like this story could overturn some of our previous assumptions. Well, Joe Biden's National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, went on CNN yesterday to answer precisely none of these questions. Instead, he told us, we're still not sure where it came from. Watch this.
Did the coronavirus pandemic start in a lab? Is that what you believe now?
Well, Dana, there is a variety of views in the intelligence community. Some elements of the intelligence community have reached conclusions on one side, some on the other. A number of them have said they just don't have enough information to be sure. And if we gain any further insider information, we will share it with Congress and we will share it with the American people. But right now, there is not a definitive answer that has emerged from the intelligence community on this question.
We just can't say for sure where COVID came from. There's no consensus. We're still debating it. Well, there's never a consensus in Washington about anything, particularly not with the intel agencies. They're lying. We know perfectly well where COVID came from. We've known this for years. In fact, one of the very first things we knew about COVID was that it was an engineered virus that escaped somehow, intentionally or not, from a Chinese military biolab in Wuhan. It was in early March of 2020, 3 full years ago, at the very beginning, that we did a long open on this show about the Chinese research paper whose authors later disappeared. Now, these Chinese scientific researchers scolded the Chinese government for the lax safety standards that they said allowed COVID to escape and infect the world. This was 3 years ago. Watch this. In fact, the outbreak may have begun not in a public meat market, but in a poorly run Chinese laboratory. Now, that's not our theory. Anyone who raises that theory on American television is attacked as a conspiracy monger. But this is a theory from a now censored Chinese paper. A draft paper posted in mid-February. Scientists at the South China University of Technology suggested that the coronavirus outbreak, began at the Wuhan Center for Disease Control, where an animal may have infected a researcher who then spread the disease outside the facility. The paper is explicit about this. We're going to quote it. The killer coronavirus probably originated from a laboratory in Wuhan, end quote. So it's not like we did a lot of hard-hitting reporting with our Chinese-speaking staff. That paper was in English on the internet, and anyone who was interested could have found it. We were just interested. That's why we found it. And then we found someone who was there. We found a Chinese physician, a scientific researcher who worked for the Chinese government, who was in and around Wuhan when COVID emerged from that lab. Her name is Li Mingyan, and we did a bunch of interviews with her. Here's one.
From my first report, I can present the solid scientific evidence to our audience that this virus, COVID-19 SARS-CoV-2 virus, actually is not from nature. I work with the top coronavirologists in the world. So together with my experience, I can tell you, this is created in the lab. This is from that template owned by China military. and also it is spread to the world to make such damage.
To make such damage, do you believe the Chinese government released this intentionally, on purpose? Did they do this?
Yes, of course, it's intentionally.
Wow. Now, we thought that was a story. So there was a physician who worked on coronaviruses for the Chinese military who was in Wuhan telling us in September of 2020 that the Chinese government did this intentionally to wreck the West, to kill people and destroy the economies of its rivals here in the West. Now, if you're a middle-class Christian American, it's hard to imagine that level of malice existing anywhere in the world. You just would never consider doing something like that. But with the Chinese, are they serious enough? Yeah, probably. But instead of following up on that, people attacked the woman you just saw, really attacked her, and then attacked us for giving her airtime. Pants on fire, you're lying, said the, quote, fact checkers. But she wasn't lying. And Tony Fauci and many others in the U.S. government knew that she wasn't lying. In fact, they knew the truth about where COVID came from long before the rest of us had even heard the term COVID. In mid-November of 2019, a friendly Asian government, we have learned, sent a cable to American officials warning that there was evidence or something strange going on in Wuhan, and it looked like a dangerous leak from a biolab. They knew that. The origins of COVID were never a secret. The real story, the great outrage of this story, is that the people who knew or should have known the truth lied about the truth. Why? To hide the Chinese government's role in mass murder, the killing of almost 7 million people and the destruction of the American economy. That's the interesting part, looking back 3 years later. From the beginning of the outbreak, the American media, as one, took the side of the Chinese government in this new propaganda war over COVID. And Trump, once again, to his credit, knew. He knew exactly where this came from. He didn't say so directly, he should have, but instead he alluded to it. He called COVID the China virus. And when he did that, he was over the target, so the Chinese government attacked him. They've learned a thing or two from watching American politics as a, quote, racist. One Chinese news outlet tweeted this, quote, racism is not the right tool to cover your own incompetence. Shut up, racist! They saw it working in America. We're going to try that. And it worked. And then the entire American press corps covered for the Chinese government. People like David Frum at The Atlantic. Oh, he's so smart. David Frum immediately parroted that slur from the Chinese government. You have to ask yourself, was David Frum taking money from Beijing to repeat their lies? We can't confirm that, but he might as well have been taking money from Beijing. And it wasn't just David Frum. NBC News called the phrase Chinese virus, quote, both inaccurate and harmful in tying racist associations between the virus and those from China. Of course, the virus was from China. It was from a Chinese military biolab, and it may have been released on purpose to kill people. It didn't matter. No one asked a single question. Joe Biden and his lackeys in the media all repeated the talking point. Watch this.
But neither should we panic or fall back on xenophobia. Labeling COVID-19 a foreign virus does not displace accountability.
The president referred to the coronavirus as a, quote, foreign virus. And I think it's going to it's going to come across to a lot of Americans as smacking of xenophobia.
The administration's labeling of this virus as foreign is undoubtedly playing into the rising xenophobia about it. Trump isn't cautioning us to check our racism, but is rather stoking xenophobic sentiment.
The president says it's a foreign virus as if this was launched on us like an attack. We know what that's about. That's about him playing xenophobia, works with his base.
Why do you keep calling this the Chinese virus? Why do you keep using this? A lot of people say it's racist.
It's not racist at all, no, not at all. It comes from China.
Every one of the people you just saw should resign in disgrace and should spend the next decade in ashes and sackcloth pondering what they've done, which is cover for a crime.